we're here in our final panel for today, and we're happy to have several guests talking about moving Virginia forward, policies and programs. So this is a great and varied group again to look at different aspects of what does that mean. We're going to touch on the state programs, kind of jump up to the federal level, and then look at some opportunities in our state for new and different policies, movement across, again, environmental, social, economic, and energy fields. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Jewel Bronaugh is the Commissioner of the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Affairs, and we're happy to have her involved. We feel that, again, agriculture, the rural sector, and agriculture and forestry, very important to our state. I just want to say agriculture, tourism, and forestry are the top three industries in our state. So folks in Northern Virginia, where I lived for many years, you tell them that and they just say, what? Isn't it high tech? You know, because that's what's in Northern Virginia. But it's actually agriculture. So she was, before this, she served as the executive director of the Center of Agriculture Research, Engagement, and Outreach at the Virginia State University. Again, that is one of our land-grant colleges in the state, working with the Virginia Cooperative Extension along with Virginia Tech with the farmers around the state. Previous to that, she was the Virginia State Executive Director of the USDA Farm Service Agency. So basically, very deep roots in the agricultural side of things. So it's great to have you here. And I'm just going to briefly introduce all the speakers here. So Chris Wiegard is a volunteer with the Richmond chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And so he will speak briefly on the national effort to introduce and find support in Congress for moving the carbon fee idea forward as a way to address carbon emissions. Leanne Williams is not here, I don't think, but she and Karen Camplin are co-chairs of the Virginia Green New Deal initiative, and Karen is also the Environmental and Climate Justice Chair for the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP. Then we have Carla Loeb, who is the Chief Policy and Development Officer at Sigora Solar, and she's here also representing the Seville Renewable Energy Alliance, looking at what energy policy might look like moving forward in our state, or should look like, depending on your point of view. So, Dr. Bronaugh, let's have you come up first.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to talk about Virginia's number one private industry. And when combined with forestry, forestry's number 3. Agriculture and forestry generate about $91 billion for our state economy. So I'm very happy to be able to provide leadership for agriculture in the state of Virginia, and happy to be here. I think I have the wrong subject for my slide, so ignore what you see at the top, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the other things regarding agriculture and how we can better build resiliency from a state level. And I kind of looked at some of those key and critical issues that we deal with in any state. And you mentioned emergency preparedness. And I always tell my staff at VDAX, it's not if another major weather event is going to come, it's when it's going to come. And so in terms of emergency preparedness, it's prepare for the worst now. I don't think that we're able to afford to wait, and we need to kind of get our ducks in a row when it comes to trying to have an emergency preparedness plan in place. I looked at North Carolina, and if you think about Hurricane Florence, it was one of the costliest disasters on record. And North Carolina estimated losses at $2.4 billion. Virginia, and I'm speaking from an agricultural standpoint, was impacted, the agriculture, about 7.5 million. But in North Carolina, 3.5 million chickens were killed during Hurricane Florence and about 5,500 hogs. So you think about the top commodities similar to Virginia. Poultry is #1 in Virginia, #2 in North Carolina. That decimates an agricultural operation and it decimates an industry. So for us at VDAX, we have to make sure that as a state agency, we are prepared. And we have a role in leading what we call Emergency Support Function 11. So we provide nutrition assistance for victims during a disaster. We report on outbreaks of contagious diseases. We make sure the commercial food supply is safe to eat. We protect natural disasters. And we provide for the well-being of what everyone loves, their household pets. So we have to make sure that there are adequate public shelters during an emergency, and that's our role. But when you think about it, I'm going to go back to North Carolina. Their governor provided $235 million for agriculture to address some of those losses that occurred during Florence. And they put money towards that because they said they wanted to build for future storm resiliency. And I really think that that is very important. In Virginia, we have worked very closely with Extension to make sure that Extension agents in the counties know how to enumerate and report loss during a disaster for agriculture. That's what helps generate money. And I think that being able to determine what that loss was in numbers is what can generate more federal money and more state money to deal with that. When I think about ag economics, I talked to a farmer yesterday. He said something, he was disgruntled. I think it's because the weather's so hot. But he said something interesting. He said a price gain for one group of farmers often means a price loss for another. I thought that was really interesting because if you have one group of farmers in a certain part of the country that are doing well, it's probably because there's another group of farmers in another part of the country that aren't. Agriculture, from an economic point of view, is kind of something that you can't use the word stability to define at all. I say that farmers are geniuses because they have to use what they know to deal with a lot of things that they don't know. And so when you think about the variation in weather, the cost of farm inputs, how much does it cost for fertilizer, seed, equipment, fuel, the challenge with labor availability, supply and demand fluctuations and export sales, the loss of international markets. Last year was probably the worst of all of those factors. So it was a tough year from an economic standpoint for Virginia farmers. I would say in Virginia, the dairy industry has suffered the most. We probably lost about 150 small dairies in the past year. It's an incredible loss of dairy farmers. So, you know, we need to think about how do we help those communities, because when you lose a farmer in a rural community, it impacts everything else in that community. The local grocery store, the place that they buy their products, the bank, etc. So to keep the community resilient, you have to keep these farm operations alive and these family farms well. In terms of water, I say that we have water quality. That's been a big issue. We put the Chesapeake Bay on a pollution diet. And we said it has to reach its pollution weight goal by 2025. So we have to reach those targeted reductions in nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment by 2025. And so we're getting there. It's just like any diet. You know, you lose a lot of weight at first, but when you get closer to your weight goal, you got to find new ways to lose weight. So now we're trying to figure out how do we put in more practices that farmers can put in place so that we can get more credit in that model to reach that 2025 goal. Certainly, when it comes to water quality, farmers have a lot of influence in that, and I say farmers are original stewards of the land before they're anything else, but they want to do good, but doing good costs money. It costs resources. So I'm happy to say that Virginia has a cost share plan that has more money in it this year for helping farmers implement best management practices on their farm. This program comes through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and so the governor has invested $73 million in 1 year in helping farmers implement these practices so they can help impact water quality. Putting fencing on an operation to keep livestock out of the stream, cover crops, grass and forested buffers, animal waste storage facilities. So that investment is really going to help farmers all across the state, or those in the watershed, to be able to implement those practices and to be able to afford to implement those practices. If we don't get rural broadband across Virginia, we're not going to move into the next century of technology, and that's something that Governor Northam is really committed to, universal access to broadband across the Commonwealth. And he has initiated about $19 million in funding through fiscal year 2020 for the Virginia Telecommunication Initiative. About $4.9 million in grant funding has gone out to try to expand, build, and improve infrastructure so that you can get broadband access to really hard-to-reach places. I think Albemarle County got a $301,000 grant, and there are other counties across the state, but that implementation of that infrastructure and having that access is critical. Farmers have equipment that allow them to use high-tech technology to make decisions. If they cannot upload that information, they can't apply that information. So that is very critical for agriculture. In terms of food access, we don't want anyone in this state to be hungry, and we want all of our citizens of Virginia to be healthy. And it's really interesting to talk about agriculture being the #1 private industry in Virginia, and there are hungry people all over the state of Virginia. And so it's not that we can't produce enough food, it's about food access, having that food readily available where people need it. And we're trying to do that, but it's a tricky issue, and there's no one solution. Every community has a different way to solve that problem. Senator Warner has proposed something called the Healthy Food Access for All Americans. He's trying to provide tax credit and grant funding to incentivize retail operations to open up in food deserts. He is really pushing this, and that also applies for funding for food banks, and it applies for farmers markets. And VDAX works very closely with farmers markets. We're trying to figure out how we can allow people in communities to use their SNAP benefits at more farmers markets. We have something called the Virginia Fresh Match Program. It is federally funded. It needs more money from the state so that more people can have access to fresh and healthy produce. So this is something that is very critical to getting healthy foods out all across the state of Virginia. And it's something that's very important that we really need to think about, because if we think about hungry children, they can't learn in school. We think about hungry seniors, they need the fresh foods for sustenance, and we all need to have healthy foods available to us. And lastly, the health care issue. I love traveling across the state because I get to talk to a lot of people, and a lady said, most people don't understand rural health care. And I said, what do you mean? I said, give me an example. And she said, well, you know, if you come to this part of Virginia, there are occasions where folks in rural communities, they might not take a shower, they might take a bath in the creek. And she said, people don't understand, they think that's gross. But she said, that's part of what folks have done in this community for years. It's not saying that they don't have running water, but when you tell someone that, they don't understand that there are people who have that mindset or have lived like that in the state of Virginia. And she said, you need to have people who understand what rural America is all about and what rural Virginia is all about to provide solutions. For me, one of the issues I've heard everywhere I go is that farmers are highly stressed, they're having mental health challenges, and are committing suicide. Many from rural communities where they're not accessing the right amount of care. And that is a priority of mine at VDAX, is to try to get resources in place so that if there are farmers who are highly stressed, they can go somewhere for help. If they're in a rural community, they can also go somewhere for help. And if they don't have money, they can also go somewhere for help. So these are some of the critical issues that VDAX touches, that agriculture touches, that are very important to me, and all of these issues we need to address to have a strong rural community all across the state of Virginia. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chris Wiegard. I'm here to represent Citizens Climate Lobby. We are a national and international volunteer group, and our core mission is to enact into law a carbon fee and dividend bill. And after 10 years, we finally actually have one. It's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, H.R. 763. It's currently being worked on in the House of Representatives. It has one Republican sponsor, and it has 56 Democrat sponsors in the House of Representatives. Our broader mission is to build political will for climate solutions, because lawmakers don't create political will, they respond to it. I suggest that when we compare mitigation, the reduction of carbon emissions, and the mission of building resilience, we look upon them as two sides of one coin. Politically speaking, mitigation without adaptation leaves citizens feeling abandoned, and their unhappiness becomes a problem for lawmakers and government executives. But resilience efforts without carbon emission reductions just delay the problem until it becomes uncontrollable. So in my mind, these approaches, if one is done without the other, it won't work. When we speak of resilience, we should also assert that carbon reductions are essential. When we speak of carbon reductions, we must propose efforts to minimize human suffering and property loss. When we talk politics, we must recognize that the concept that climate change is a partisan issue must be fiction, because no process that threatens the survival of the grandchildren of both political parties can be a partisan issue. So a little word about our solution. Well, when we look at climate solutions, and we don't claim to have the solution, we have a solution, it needs to drive large-scale change quickly and across all sectors, not just power generation. We've heard that transportation is a big slice of carbon emissions in Virginia. It should use incentives that support choice, because people care about freedom. It should have bipartisan appeal. It should be fair, and it should be politically durable, and it should be healthy for the planet and for the economy. This is the basics of our bill. You can look our bill up and read it if you feel like it, but it's got 4 features. Carbon fee, it puts a fee on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. It starts low, it grows over time. This alters the energy market, shifting it away from carbon. The carbon dividend is the money that's collected from the carbon fee. It's given back in equal shares to the American people, with half shares to children under 18. It also has a border carbon adjustment, and this is very important because it's possible for carbon policy to sort of bleed over into other countries, sort of push carbon emissions into other countries. If we institute this feature, then imported goods will pay a border carbon adjustment, and goods exported from the United States will receive a refund. So, one of the talking points for people who don't want to do anything about carbon emissions is, oh, other countries will exploit us and cheat and get an unfair advantage over us. Well, not if they're being charged a tariff when they try to import their products. And that's based on their refusal to price their own carbon. If they price their own carbon, fine, then we don't need to tariff them. And regulatory adjustment, that is very limited, and it's been sort of a bone of contention on this. In order to try to get some bipartisan appeal, we allowed this bill to have the feature that it delays additional regulations on CO2 emissions at EPA as long as emission targets are being met. And then EPA regulatory authority over emissions would be restored if not met in 10 years. So currently EPA is not doing anything about CO2 emissions. We would propose that we allow that we put forth this marketplace solution, and then if it doesn't work, the bill says, okay, if this doesn't work, EPA gets the regulatory authority in 10 years. Economists tell us that it would work, and we believe economists. Okay, so to summarize, it would reduce America's carbon emissions by 40% within 12 years, according to economists. It's good for people because it gives them money back so that the higher costs of fossil fuels will not cause them to give up on the idea. We won't hopefully have any Paris riots under this proposal because people are getting money back to help them with the added costs. It's good for the economy. Renewable energy employs more people per unit of energy. And some of the jobs would not be renewable energy jobs. Some of the jobs would simply be service jobs because more money moving through the economy creates more jobs. And it's revenue neutral, allocate fees collected to Americans to spend any way they choose. In theory, that should be okay with conservatives. But as I said, we've got one Republican sponsor. Okay, so as I said, H.R. 763 is not the solution to climate change, but is a piece of the puzzle that helps many other pieces to fit. During the break, I was having some discussions with people, and I asked them, would it help what you are trying to accomplish if gasoline went up by 10 cents a gallon predictably over a period of years so that people would see that the days of cheap gasoline are gone? And I got the answer, yeah, that would probably make my job easier, trying to get people to drive electric cars, trying to set up electricity storage programs connecting to solar. Yeah, it would probably help, because if fossil fuels lose their unfair price advantage, I'm in better shape. For the economists in the audience, we're talking about externalized cost or market failure. In other words, what is the real offense with fossil fuels? Well, okay, the smoke kills some people. But the real offense in terms of climate change is that they use the sky as their carbon dump, and the sky does not belong to them. So change that. Force them to pay, and it'll look a little bit like tobacco. Warning labels didn't really do a lot. When it got to be more expensive to buy cigarettes, a lot of people quit. So finally, returning to the theme of the conference, we need to connect rural and urban communities in Virginia, both in terms of resilience, but also in terms of willingness to cut carbon. In Richmond, where I live, the mayor recently sponsored the U.S. Conference of Mayors resolution in favor of carbon pricing. But in Virginia, we also have got rural communities in the Southwest who are very, very opposed to any transition away from coal. We need to reduce conflict by showing rural voters in Virginia that their communities and their citizens would benefit from a low-carbon future, not just in terms of eventual survival, but also in terms of money. Climate solutions should be designed to cut carbon, but also to be politically durable, not like presidential executive orders where the chalkboard gets wiped after the next election. We must pass a national law that will not be erased. But the process of getting there doesn't contain shortcuts. It's called democracy. We have to prove that the American experiment in self-government still works, that we retain the ability to solve our problems through the rule of law. As a global problem, climate change cannot be addressed through promises of carbon cuts alone. It can be addressed the way other issues have been addressed, with the USA taking meaningful action that pushes other nations to follow.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Camblin. I'm the co-chair for the Green New Deal Virginia. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to go over briefly what the Green New Deal entails. The Green New Deal is looking at how can we combat these climate change climate change issues, while also having a social justice focus. And that is a really key and important part of the Green New Deal Virginia. So somebody explained it to me. If you take a Venn diagram, a three-circle Venn diagram, environment is one, economy and jobs is another, and equity is the third. And that shaded piece in the middle of that Venn diagram, that's the Green New Deal. We're looking for solutions that intersects with all of those three. We feel that as we move to a clean energy economy, to make sure that no one is left behind, social justice needs to be front and center. So with the Green New Deal, Virginia is working with a coalition of very many grassroots social justice, environmental, and labor groups throughout the Commonwealth, looking at solutions. And how do we address these things? And like I said, well, let me go back to this. It's really hard to see, but I have some handouts, and that is the key mission of what the Green New Deal Virginia entails. It's hard to read, but it is to support and encourage the creation of thousands of high-quality jobs while combating climate issues and making sure that everyone has access to it. When we first started it, we had 4 policy themes. Going to renewable energy, supporting and promoting and encouraging clean air, water, and land, and looking at those types of things. But as we started talking with our different community organizations, we found out that we missed a key element of the Green New Deal Virginia, which is transportation. In Virginia, transportation is the leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, approximately 46%. And so we cannot move forward without having a focus on clean transportation that is conducted equitably. So in April of this year, we had a coalition summit in Richmond where we had over 100 people attend. And we looked at how all of these things intersect. We asked environmentalists to sit with labor groups, to sit with social justice. And as we think of our solution, we think outside of the box and say, well, if we come up with this environmental solution, for instance, how is that going to impact equity? How is that going to impact labor? How is that going to impact small businesses? And how is that going to impact our small farmers? And that was an exercise to make sure everybody had a broader view. We want to break down those, as we're breaking down these barriers, we also want to break down the silos and have everybody at the same table. And so our coalition summit was kicked off by Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is one of the leading creators of the Office of Civil Rights in EPA. And he had since left and was working with the Hip Hop Caucus, and he's now with National Wildlife Federation. And he brought us to the point where we had a very hard discussion on some of the systemic barrier conversations that need to be had, and also the conversations that we always have every day dealing with the environment. And we've been going across the Commonwealth of Virginia. We spoke at the Women's Summit, and we've spoken at various different community organizations. And so these are our 4 policy themes. Again, this is really hard to read. But it is to develop a just and equitable 100% renewable energy plan. And I'll just summarize them. looking at large investments and supporting jobs, thousands of jobs within the Commonwealth of Virginia, supporting any policies and policy changes or that would support clean air, water, land for all Virginians, and invest in local scale agriculture. So we're reaching out to all of the small farms around the Commonwealth. And the fifth one, as I told you, that was identified as part of the coalition summit meeting, developing an equitable and clean and sustainable transportation infrastructure. So our coalition group at the summit, we thought that we needed to break out into working groups and kind of delve into each of these different issues that are impacting residents in the Commonwealth. And the working groups are responsible for doing the proper research, defining what that particular working group is, and looking for solutions to address the climate change, climate problems in Virginia. And so we have 8 policy-focused groups and 1 which is focused more on public outreach and education. So I'll just go over briefly what these 8 policy groups are. The first one is democratic governance. And so this group is looking at issues, ways to remove the systemic barriers that prevent true participation in our government and in decision making. So that could include voter registration, making sure voter rights is protected, redistricting, campaign financing reform, those types of things is what the more democratic governance working group is looking at. Then we also have a group, sustainable jobs, worker protection, payroll protection, and the like. So they're looking at those types of things, and we have representatives from unions that are a part of this from all walks of the various industries within the Commonwealth. Social justice and health disparities, making sure, for instance, that returning citizens have access to the right funding that would allow them to go and continue education or start their own businesses. Returning citizens have some limitations as to types of financial and technical support that they're able to have access to. So we're going to try and find ways to remove those barriers. Defossilization, energy efficiency and renewables, looking at removing barriers to community solar. And we want to make sure that our communities are resilient, and that's one of the ways that we can make sure that happens. Healthier, sustainable rural communities. One of the key things, and I'll give you an example of how important rural broadband, I know it was brought up earlier, but rural broadband is really and truly vital to the livelihood and the vitality of a community. I'm quite sure you've heard of the Buckingham County Union Hill compressor station that's going on right now. But the residents of Buckingham County, they want to be self-reliant, right? They're saying, we don't want Dominion to be the guardian of what we do or what we do not do. So they were able to find financial funders who was willing to help pay for training, solar panel installation training. But they also had another problem. You need internet access to be able to have that training, and they do not have internet in Union Hill. So they were able to find another supporter, funder, to help bring rural broadband in. And they have it at one of the historically African-American churches that is in Union Hill. So they now have a community hub. And this community hub not only served as the location for the training, but it is where children after school can do extra homework or access more information. And it's also a place where they can go and just have community gatherings. And it has increased the vitality of Buckingham County. And through this, they can then do other things of, now that they have residents who know how to install solar panel, they can now look at putting it on their own homes. There is a job guarantee program, and some of the students in that training session were returning citizens. So it's also increasing access to valuable jobs. Another one of our working groups is Healthier Air, Land, and Water. And they're looking at various things. I'll just give an example of they want to find funding that would help support a robust program that would lead us towards zero waste. I know we talk about it. There are a lot of different thoughts and theories on how this can be done, but we need the funding behind it. So we're going to be looking at that. And then sustainable cities and transportation. And this one is kind of unique and actually is very dear to my heart. But this will not be a one-size-fit-all. I'm in the Northern Virginia area, but my transportation issues are different from somebody who's in the western part of the state, who's in the southern part of the state. So we have representatives who are throughout the Commonwealth who are looking at all of these different types of issues that we can bring to the table and find solutions for. And of all those different 8 policy groups, we have overlapping issues, right? So, for instance, our healthier, sustainable rural communities, they're looking at how do we encourage practices that promote healthier soils, which will be the, overlap with our food and agriculture groups. So all of our working groups are working together as well to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel. We're getting experts to come in and tell us what they're doing, and we're looking at best practices outside of the state for ideas, and even outside of the country. And I think that's it. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Carla Loeb, and I work for Sigora Solar. I am the Chief Policy and Development Officer, but I also am a member of Seaville REA. As Annette mentioned, that is the Charlottesville Renewable Energy Alliance. We are composed of 8 member companies, Pan Technology of clean energy. So we have wind energy companies, particularly Apex, which is one of the largest developers of utility-scale wind energy in the country. We have solar companies, both utility-scale solar developers as well as distributed generation or rooftop, what you may see in your houses, and you've probably seen our vehicles around town. We also have battery technology companies that are members, and lastly, we have generally management companies, so what manages your household consumption. I tell you about all of these technologies partially because we're here to talk about resiliency, and we're talking about resiliency both in the urban setting as well as in the rural setting. But we can't talk about resiliency unless we talk about the threats and the vulnerabilities. And so, we are the tools by which we can address some of these issues, meaning our companies can help to fight and mitigate the effects of climate change, of weather security threats, et cetera, but really understanding the different types and variabilities across the Commonwealth that are vulnerable. So I'm not sure if you guys know, but 60% of all data traffic in the entire world goes through the northern neck of Virginia. 60% of everything that happens in the world goes through Northern Virginia. Norfolk is one of the largest ports in the entire world. Our military complex basically is operated out of that. Historically, one of the largest generation of any type of energy are coal facilities in southwestern Virginia that have been left behind that absolutely need to get brought up both from a technology standpoint, from an energy standpoint, et cetera. I am originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. You might have heard of it. You might have heard of it more particularly in context of climate change and or disasters. So just a stat, and granted, it's been 13 years since, or 14 years now. It'll be 14 years August 29th. Yes, I know the date. Since Katrina hit New Orleans. It was a $150 billion impact. We are, fast forward, 14 years later, and still dealing with the ramifications, both good and bad, but still dealing with it. In perspective, I know the deputy director was talking about what happened in North Carolina. Harvey in Texas was $125 billion. Katrina was actually the largest single disaster that's ever occurred. And that's at a major port. So you liken New Orleans potentially to Norfolk. They both happen to be two cities that are part of the resiliency network across the nation. They are committed to developing solutions. I'm sure many of you are from Norfolk, or some of you have affiliations with Norfolk. We have innumerable vulnerabilities. And so we need to leverage the tools, and again, the tools that we have are our technologies. And how do we deploy these technologies, and how do we think about these technologies? So for example, we have one of the smartest technology companies really in the world. So Fluence, which actually operates out of Northern Virginia, is a partnership between Siemens, which I'm sure you've heard of, as well as AES. I bring them up not because they're a member of CVIL REA, but you also know about Maria that happened in Puerto Rico. Well, what happened after Maria? Well, we had to recontemplate the entire energy infrastructure and how people were going to have electricity. And how that was done was a group of engineers from Fluence got into a room, mapped out how to rebuild the entire infrastructure of what Puerto Rico could look like. They did that thinking about microgrids. So microgrids compiled of batteries, solar, lines and wires, and management of technologies generally. So again, all of the tools that go into CVIL REA. They were able to determine that it was actually less expensive to build all new microgrids across Puerto Rico than it would be to rebuild that same infrastructure that had existed before, because the anticipation is it's going to get knocked down again. They were able to do it at a cost. They worked with legislators and regulators, and now Puerto Rico has moved forward with a 100% resiliency plan and are rebuilding their infrastructure to be resilient. We are dramatically vulnerable in Virginia, in urban areas and in rural areas. And if we don't start leveraging the technologies and the intellect and the wherewithal and know-how that we currently have in the Commonwealth, we may be another Puerto Rico. If Norfolk is dramatically hit, which, by the way, I think the stat is over 300 days of sustained flooding a year in Norfolk, it's already happening. If we have a cyber attack or a physical attack on the northern neck of Virginia, these are all things that have to be dealt with. We have the tools in Virginia, and we need to rely on our legislators, policymakers, everyone in this room to make sure that we're taking the steps to be secure, to be resilient, and to look forward, and not do things the same way we've done them in the past. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for a few questions. I don't know if there's a mic, but if folks have questions, why don't you just speak up?
What is the thought process behind, obviously when you start giving money to folks, how do you then, as the infrastructure changes and it goes from a carbon-based to more of a renewable-based, how do you address the concept of then taking that money away from people? Or having it shrivel up, if you will?
Yeah, that's that is a great question, and I think that's something that I've had a congressman say to me, actually. Carbon fee and dividend is not really, the idea behind it is to make a transition, okay? So once the transition is made, there is no intention of continuing the dividend. So it's like, I guess if you look at it from a moral or a philosophical standpoint, why are you giving the dividend to people? Well, you're giving the dividend to people because you're compelling them to be involved in a transition of our entire society away from fossil fuels and to renewable energy. That's a big project. And what we want to avoid in that project is forcing people to support that transition, but not giving them the resources to achieve that transition. So, no, there is no real intention for the dividend to be a permanent thing. Once fossil fuels are kind of marginalized in society, probably the way it would go would be coal first, because coal has got a lot of carbon in it. Natural gas per unit of energy is about half as much carbon. And then, of course, there are petroleum products. But as we transition away from those and the carbon fee money dries up, then we would say, okay, we're done here. We have a new society, mission accomplished. There's no dividend because there's no fee anymore.
I'd just like to add on to that. Again, I do policy both on a local level, state level, and federal level, and the carbon dividend tax is one tool, policy tool. Again, I keep talking about tools, but it's all about tools. It's like, what are our resources and how do we deploy them? And so, we have the Green New Deal, which is a basically menu of policy solutions. So there isn't anything that's going to happen, one, in isolation. And so when we're talking about transitioning the economy, it's transitioning it in such a way that, if you're getting a $25 check on an annual basis or whatever the dividend ends up being, what the contemplation is, the entire economy is going to change. Your job is going to be different. You're going to have a good paying job that is going to be able to basically augment or replace what that dividend might be. It's not like Social Security. It's not like these other programs that have been in place for a very long time. It is literally about transitioning the economy overall, and it's one of the tools that we will use to do that.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Hi, I'm relatively new to resilience, and I've learned a lot. I came here to learn, and it's been accomplished, so thank you. But I have a hard time sometimes bringing it all together, and a lot of times I go to conferences on wealth building or social economic mobility, et cetera, and it helps to have maybe a measure or an index that lets us know when we've moved from one place to the next, when we've actually made some headway or moved the needle. Can anyone point me to a resource that maybe allows me to be able to look at the different communities in my footprint and say, this has the highest need, and this is where they score on this particular index, so this is where we're going to dedicate some resources or inform the community that, this is where the highest need is, and here are some tools or a menu of options?
I think that depends on the segment and sector. Sorry, I'm just going to start answering questions. I think it kind of depends on the segment and sector. I mean, if you're talking about energy, a good proxy on a household level is to understand what a household's energy burden is. So how much they're spending on a month of their household income on their energy bills. There is a tool that's actually a nationally available tool, but they have it for Virginia specifically. They have the data by state, by county, by zip code, I think, called the LEAD tool, and it's through the Department of Energy, and it's been basically categorized both from a single-family home standpoint, multifamily home standpoint, owner-occupied, not owner-occupied. In the case of food, you'd be looking at food deserts, so that's access to clean and healthy foods. We're talking about moving away from traditional energy, so there are a lot of studies put out by NRDC and several other organizations about people's impacts and how close they're living to fossil fuel generation facilities. And so you could see the percentages of how those communities where they're living now, are they living next to clean energy resources? What is kind of their health, wellness, and general beings. But I mean, looking at rates of asthma, I mean, this kind of, it's pan technology, pan sector. And so I wouldn't say, I mean, as far as I know, there isn't a single house that's going to have all of these different data points for you, but in all of these different sectors, people are studying it. Because it affects our economy in such a pivotal way. I mean, our health costs are super high because we have really high pollution and people are suffering. You know, our bills are expensive because we have to pay maintenance costs for traditional energy. You know, our food costs are high because we don't have access to clean vegetables. So.
I would just add just a little bit to that in terms of, instead of maybe looking for the raw data, identify the leading organization and look for their reports, and then maybe go to their footnotes and see where they got it. But there are a lot of organizations that already have done the legwork and have wrote, you know, a lot of different things, whether it's NAACP, Sierra Club, you know, the physicians.
Yeah, the physicians
groups and stuff. So there's a lot of, and I know you're saying, how do I narrow my focus down? I would probably go to that leading organization, see what reports they did, and just take it from there and look at footnotes, resources list, and stuff like that.
Sorry,
Joel, you have a comment.
Yeah, I might answer maybe a little more general, but if you're looking from a general standpoint in the community, there's a cooperative extension program in counties and cities all across the state, and their extension agents, and they have always kind of done a county report of the issues around agriculture, families, health, youth, and community issues. And they would prioritize what those top issues were in that particular city and county. And I know those reports were how we would decide what were the biggest issues in any particular county or city. So that may be a general place to start for that information. And then you could maybe narrow down and be more specific. But that is an extension assesses those critical issues in each of the counties and cities across the state. So that may be a starting place for you.
And I'm going to add just two more things, and then we'll wrap this up. But the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at UVA, along with William and Mary and ODU, created a toolkit essentially to go in working in communities to assess their resiliency based on certain standards, and then are working to help them address what they need to move forward, which can be, again, going in several different directions. We also have a resiliency checklist for local governments, and what you see is that when you kind of research this, there are many guides, research guides, or practical community-based guides. So this is a great segue into tomorrow, and then I will wrap this up. So with that, I want to thank our speakers here in our plenary panel. So let's thank them.